Welcome everyone to the sixth seminar of From Research to Resilience from the Waterland and Ecosystems Program. My name is Rosalind Wiemans. I'm the co-lead together with Natalia Estrada of the Enhancing Sustainability Across Agriculture Systems flagship. And this webinar is focusing on boosting synergies and managing trade-offs in food and agriculture systems. Now, why this session? Very shortly to introduce it, it's that there has been a strong evidence base built and a broad recognition that food and agriculture systems have major impacts on multiple social, economic, and environmental outcomes. Now, often the problem side of this is emphasized, but food and agriculture systems therefore also provide a really unique and powerful solution space to act upon these multiple social, environmental, and economic goals simultaneously. But how can we better leverage this potential of multifunctionality and better anticipate and actively manage for synergies and trade-offs between people's and planet's outcomes in food and agriculture systems? And that is the focus of this session. And we are very excited to have here a fantastic group of speakers and panelists together that hopefully trigger your mind and further interest in this topic and to further collaborate with us on this. We first start with Fabrice de Clerk and Wei Zhong, who will both give a short presentation on this topic. Fabrice, I'll give the word to you.
Great, thanks, Rosalind. So good to see you all here. Let me quickly share my screen and then get a confirmation from Rosalind that things look good on your side.
Yes, looks
fantastic. Great. Good. Thanks, Rosalind. And hello, everyone. My name is Fabrice de Clerk, Science Director with the EAT Foundation, and also a Senior Scientist with the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT of CGIAR. And I think this is just such a critically important topic, and I'm so glad that we're emphasizing synergies and trade-offs in agriculture. From our work looking at Earth systems perspective sustainability, it's very clear to us that the way that we produce foods, what foods we produce, how we produce them, are major drivers of environmental degradation. What we're also seeing is that food, and particularly those who produce food, are most likely to be the first victims of that degradation. But I think critically important is that food has become our best bet at addressing both environmental concerns, health concerns, and livelihood concerns. And so major opportunity space by focusing on food. What we find ourselves in now is a critical period in human history. We've entered the Anthropocene, which represents a period where human influence on the environment has reached planetary scale. And what that means, that decisions that we make, particularly in terms of how we produce food and what foods we produce, are going to have lasting critical consequences, not just locally, but also globally. And so we really need to transition into a vision of food production that is about nature positive production. That is recognizing that the challenges we're faced with are how do we achieve food security? How do we achieve nutritional security? How do we achieve climate security, environmental security, and livelihood security? And that we really cannot afford to make one of those goals more important than the other. As soon as we do, we begin to prioritize one and begin, I think, to fall into the challenges that we're seeing with today's production systems. By placing all of those 5 challenges equal, what also becomes evident is the critical trade-offs that we need to address. And it's really important that we begin to confront those and face those. At the same time, once we've identified them, the synergies will be where the solutions are. And so I think we don't speak enough to those synergies. And I'll speak to a couple of them. There's 3 major elements of biodiversity in agriculture that I want to flag today. 1 is diversity in diets, 2, diversity in agriculture, and 3 is the need for agriculture to recognize its role and its impact on wild biodiversity. So the first one, diversity in diets. And one of the critical things that we did at the Atlantic Commission was to propose what we felt are universal guidelines for healthy foods. This is sufficient calories for everyone, so everyone everywhere should have access to 2,500 calories. There are people who are significantly under that value, which is a significant concern, and the number of hungry have increased over the past 4 years. There's also a big set of individuals that are significantly over that limit. In the West, in the US, and in Europe, we're often consuming 3,700 calories per day, which is an equally important challenge. And then second, complementing that quantity of diet, that human right to enough food, is the quality of food. And what we proposed in the Atlantic Commission was what the ranges of foods within major food groups should be in order to reduce the risk of premature mortality. I don't want to dwell on numbers here because we're quite short on time, but what we found with this is that there's tremendous flexibility of choice. There's multiple pathways and many options that bring us within healthy diet. And many of these require or really celebrate, I think, traditional diets, increasing food diversity, and make use of local crops. We've also found that much of the conversation around food shifts seems stuck, unfortunately, on this notion of needing to reduce meat consumption. And it's absolutely true that many of us are over-consuming red meat in particular, and that reducing consumption of red meat has significant impact on improving dietary health and is a major contribution to environmental health. So one of those first critical synergies that we're talking about. But maybe less talked about is that when we look at the primary drivers of premature mortality related to diet, this is what you have on this table here, that low dietary diversity are really the top factors. Number one factor is overconsumption of sodium, but then number two is underconsumption of whole grains. Number three, underconsumption of fruit. Number four, underconsumption of nuts and seeds. Number five, underconsumption of vegetables. We then go down to fish, fiber, and legumes. So really, if you want to get a solution, it's how do we achieve or increase consumption of this diversity? Diversity of fruits, nuts, vegetables, seeds, and whole grains. So I think a major challenge for those of us working in food production to collaborate with consumption in terms of making that diversity available, producing it sustainably, and opportunities, again, to have a double impact on both environment and health. The second piece that I want to emphasize is the role of diversity in agriculture. And here I think agroecology, in its simplest sense, the study of ecology in agricultural systems, is the foundation of a nature positive agriculture. It's about leveraging and using biodiversity in production systems and recognizes that by using this diversity, we are trying to regenerate or generate ecosystem services to and from agriculture. This was a core piece of work led by W. Lee, especially during its inception. What I want to emphasize with this as well is that there is no single agroecological practice. And while this can be frustrating to many, it's also, I think, the real value of agroecology is that the context defines which practices are the ones that are best available to farmers, most appropriate to that environment, best adapted to that climate. But the key outcomes are making sure that we're working towards better food production, better environmental outcomes, better soil carbon capture, better above ground carbon capture, habitat for biodiversity, and better livelihood outcomes. But again, it's regenerating those multiple services. One of the elements that frustrates me quite often as an agroecologist is this debate in terms of agroecology not being able to provide for food security. I see Rosalind coming on, so I must speed up, it looks like. And I think that there's ample evidence that agroecology can provide multiple benefits. Diversification of production systems is not fundamentally at odds with food security, and we really need to be better at communicating that. Rather, there's ample evidence that there are diversity of practices, a number of practices that are synergistic with yield increases, but with these environmental outcomes. The third and penultimate message that I want to share is that those of us working in food, I think, need to be better at recognizing conservation biology challenges. What we have on this figure here is 6 regions of the world, work that Natalia and Sarah and I worked on, that looks at the status of each country ecoregion and how they are doing in terms of the amount of land that remains intact, the x-axis, and the amount of land that remains integrous. For us, intactness is about preserving species and maintaining global biophysical functions, carbon capture, water cycle, nutrient cycles. And we propose that we're probably going to need to maintain at least 40 to 60% intact in order to meet conservation biology objectives. What worries me as a conservation biologist is the number of country ecoregions that are on that horizontal bar on the left. These are basically ecoregions where we have lost any resemblance of intactness and basically have become extinct ecoregions, if you will. On the y-axis is integrity, and this is the capacity of ecological systems, biodiversity, native or non-native, to contribute to those functions essential to human well-being: pollination, pest control, soil carbon capture, interception of nutrients in water. I'm almost done, Rosalind. And here, I think the big challenge for this work in agroecology is how do we bring those values up? There's a growing number of regions where food is produced that are in the red, and where we estimate that there is insufficient agricultural biodiversity in order to provide those support functions. So what I would like to propose to you is that 40% of our global lands are under agriculture. It's no longer sufficient these places just become regions of caloric production, but we ultimately and we urgently need to be working in terms of how we can improve the contribution of these places, particularly those in red, to both earth system processes, local ecosystem services, and food nutritional security. Thanks, Rosalind, and I hope that that was useful.
Super. Thanks very much, Fabrice, for providing insights on diversity as an entry point for synergies at these different levels. Thank you. So now we go to Wei Zhong, who's a senior research fellow at IFPRI, and she will focus in on a case study from India. The floor is yours, Wei. Thank you.
Thank you, Ro. Share my screen. All right, are you all able to see it?
Yes, now we are.
Yes, thank you. My name is Wei Zhong. I'm a senior research fellow at IFPRI. Background is agricultural environmental economics. I've been working on natural resource governance, ecosystem service management, and just based generally the intersection between agriculture, nature, and development. Today's presentation draws from a partnership between IFPRI and the Foundation for Ecological Security, FES, an NGO based in India, which has been working on the sustainable management of commons with local communities for 20 years. Professor Harpinder Sindhu, formerly with University of South Australia, currently Federation University in South Australia, and my colleagues at CG centers and research programs, including PIM, WLE. I'm very proud of this, to be part of this partnership. So the commons are natural resources held and used collectively. A third of India's population, especially marginalized groups, depends on the commons. Yet commons have faced significant decline over the past 5 decades or so in India, resulting in biodiversity losses, land degradation, acute water scarcity, and livelihood loss. According to the 2011 census data, there are at least 66.5 million hectares of common lands in India. Forest is dominant type of common lands, accounting for about 50% of the common lands. Barren and unculturable land, accounting for about 18%, permanent pasture land about 14%, and culturable wasteland accounting for about 19%. At the national scale, we mapped the concentration of these 4 types of common lands in terms of proportional areas in districts, demographic and socioeconomic indicators, such as the proportion of scheduled tribe population and multidimensional poverty index levels, and dependencies on tangible uses such as proportion of households using firewood for cooking. So these are just some examples of maps we've been developing. Exploring the spatial correlation and overlap can shed light on potentials for synergistic effects in terms of possible locations where sustainable management or restoration of commons can potentially add value to biodiversity conservation and carbon capture while benefiting local communities, especially traditionally marginalized groups. It can also illuminate protected areas, frontiers, where the lines between communal and state land rights are blurred, and governance issues such as use rights and access restrictions have potentially important implications for local communities. Note that those maps are just illustrative. We can build a better profile with different data, but these are just taken as proxies for profile of rural communities and not to be comprehensive at this stage. So commons sustainably managed by local communities have considerable potential to deliver multiple benefits, including local livelihoods, sources of income, household subsistence needs, environmental goods and services, including landscape biodiversity, ecosystem services, carbon, of course, capture, but also cultural and spiritual services, such as a safety net function for the, local people. For example, a recent study in which FES is involved in explores how restoration of commons through local environment stewardship initiatives contribute to the resilience of rural livelihoods in the face of climate change in 6 villages in 2 districts in the state of Rajasthan in India. It finds that secure property rights and collective management of commons enhances household resilience and improves ecological health. The study concludes that processes supporting local self-governance need to be central to local adaptation to climate change, as they naturally create resilience and sustainable rural livelihoods. So here we highlight 3 leverage points for boosting synergies between livelihoods, food security, biodiversity, and climate change responses agendas. First, strengthening governance. Communities often lack a secure tenure to the commons, which are frequently perceived as wastelands and converted to other land uses, despite providing value to community and society. Sequestering carbon and contributing to agriculture. This leverage point entails working towards a rights-based management system that fosters community ownership and seeking equitable governance, the success of which depends on communities' capacity to manage and restore commons. Second, making the economic case for investing in commons. Why evaluation? Most commons are undervalued or not valued at all. Their economic worth is unknown, and they are not considered in national accounts or GDP. Valuation of ecosystem services commons provide is key to drawing attention to these issues and soliciting support from policymakers by estimating commons contribution to livelihoods and the planet. Oopsie. So the preliminary results from our study, which is based on a systematic review of the literature and benefit transfer valuation method, identified 34 ecosystem services, including 12 provisioning, 12 regulating, 6 cultural, and 4 supporting ecosystem services provided by Indian commons. The study estimated that 66.6 million hectares of commons in India provide ecosystem services worth at least $90.5 billion per year. Commons are important contributor of provisioning ecosystem services such as food, water, fishery, honey, field wood, fodder, worth 43 billion US dollars annually in India. In comparison, agriculture generates $271 billion dollars of gross value from 159 million hectares of land. Commons contribute about 5% to GDP as compared to 15% by the agriculture sector. So third, in addition to making the economic case, another key leverage point is to unlock financial opportunities, such as biodiversity conservation financing, carbon credit, and development aid to support local communities in commons governance and restoration for multiple social and environmental benefits. In India, directing funds from the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme towards restoration is a benefit multiplier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wei, for these insights from the India case study. I'll now invite all the panelists to put on their camera as we move to reflections and insights from different points of view. I'm very excited to introduce you this panel. So we have Pablo Titonel here, who is a principal investigator at the National Agricultural Research Council of Argentina, and also a WWF chair professor at the University of Groningen. We have Alejandra Martina Salinas, who is a research associate at the Tropical Agriculture Research and Higher Education Center in Costa Rica. We have Emmeline Fellus, who is the director of the Food Reform and Sustainability and Health Initiative, FRESH, of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, based in Switzerland. And we have Webster Ishianopa Makombe, who is a youth leader and activist for Act for Food, Act for Change, based in Zimbabwe. So we will start with an initial question for the panelists to give your perspective on what are key leverage or entry points for better creating and actively managing win-win situations between people's outcomes and planet outcomes in food and agriculture systems. And I also invite all the people online to also post in the meantime questions and comments that they might have. Okay, so we'll start with Pablo. Pablo, if you can give from your perspective as part of the National Research Council of Argentina and as a WWF chair, give your perspective on key leverage points for more creating win-win situations more actively between people's and planet's outcomes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to both presenters for a very insightful presentation and inspiring for reaction. Yeah, well, I think one of the keywords that was implicit in this presentation, but not explicitly mentioned, is multifunctionality. And multifunctionality is important because we've been simplifying landscapes through the process of agricultural intensification and moving from multiple functions of those landscapes to really one or two functions, and mostly in agriculture it's just one single production function. And many of the symptoms that Fabrice was showing us actually had to do with the fact that we are only focusing on one function and forgetting about the others. So for example, if we look at one of the slides that Fabrice showed in his presentation that was very informative, this analysis of integrity in the biomes or the ecoregions of Europe, of the world, but I mean, in the case of Europe was actually quite telling for me, because you see actually relatively few cases in the reds, basically, right? Which means that there is quite some integrity in the y-axis, but that is not weighted by the number of people living in rural areas, right? So in Europe, the number of farmers, I mean, biodiversity is going down, but also the number of farmers is going down. So there's less and less people, and the GDP of Europe, of European countries, depends less and less on agriculture. And so if we put there, let's say, the damage or the impact of agriculture per person living on rural areas or living out of the land, it's actually huge. Whereas in the other continents where we see a lot more, let's say, less integrity in the ecosystems, well, we should also account for the number of people that are being fed and that are living and developing their livelihoods in those rural areas. So I think that is one way of starting to look at trade-offs of multiple functions, not just the productive function, not just the ecological function, but also the livelihoods approach. So I think that for me was a quite telling example that I think it illustrates this need for a multifunctional approach where we look at the trade-off between different functions that we expect from the landscapes. I could continue an hour, but
great. Thank you very much, Pablo, for this reflection. Also, we go also to now to listen to Alejandra Martinez Salinas from CATI from Costa Rica, country that just won also the Earthshot Prize. So yeah, Alejandra, from your perspective and some reflections on the presentation and from your perspectives in Costa Rica, what are some key leverage points for win-win and how to further support this?
Thank you very much, Rosalind, and thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, as Pablo mentioned, I think both presentations, Fabrice's and Wei were very interesting and set up like a very nice base to this discussion. I think that one of the things that actually Wei mentioned on her last slides was governance, the importance of strengthening governance and working with the communities, empowering the communities, and all of these ideas of community-based management. Now that you mentioned also the Earthshot Prize that Costa Rica just won last Sunday, I want to also mention a little bit about the importance of policies, public policies that are important to promote desired changes. I think there's been really good efforts, and I'm talking about Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the countries that I know the best in the last decades, to promote and have like these public policies that can work together to strengthen the synergies and reduce the trade-offs between the necessity of food production, but also the necessity of conserving biodiversity and natural systems to actually support those food production systems. So in terms of the story of Costa Rica, the story of success, it's a lot of the success has been based on working on strengthening the governance and the public policies that are directed to acknowledge that the goals of economic growth and the protection of biodiversity and natural capital must be aligned. And that it's easy to say, but it's really hard to do. One of the good samples is the prize that I just received last Sunday, which is basically for its payment for ecosystem services, which is a program that is designed to pay farmers or private owners to protect the forest and water. At the beginning, that was the main concept, but recently, for instance, it has evolved to actually acknowledge the role of trees in farms and how important it is to promote our forestry systems. So it's a complex subject. But one of the things that has proven to be successful, and when I say successful, I don't mean perfect. By no means it has been a perfect program. It has many problems, but one of the things that it's important to keep thinking about is how do we mainstream biodiversity and natural capital into policies and public planning, so we have the resources and the ground, the base ground to actually build other things. At the beginning of this webinar, we were exchanging some comments and thinking about different challenges. So one of them is that we know a lot about biodiversity, and I think Fabrice's presentation at the beginning is very enlightening, but there's still a lot we don't know. And the whole food system depends on biodiversity and ecosystem services. One of the major gaps that we have right now, for instance, still persistent, is we don't know exactly what are the synergies and trade-offs of ecosystem services and food systems. And I think having more knowledge about it can help us ground conservation initiatives that can help establish once for all the linkages between productivity and biodiversity conservation. I don't know if it happens in Europe, but in Latin America, it's very common that that linkage is not so clear for people. So I know we talk about knowledge all the time, and that it's important to work on creating knowledge and filling knowledge gaps. But the reality of things is that we do research, but this research is not going to the people. It's not going to the ones that are actually making the decisions on the ground or on the farms or on the plots. So I think that's also another important thing. in order to leverage where the synergies are, and also to reduce the trade-offs that we find in food systems and conservation, and trying to promote sustainable development. And on top of that, now considering challenges added by climate change. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much also, Alejandra. So we have also emphasis on livelihood by Pablo, and the emphasis on the biodiversity and mainstreaming that further into programs across, and the emphasis on connecting the knowledge across the food system. Emmeline, from your perspective at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, what would you like to emphasize in this, considering also the business and consumer perspective?
Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to have heard the presentations and inputs before, because I think they will go in the same direction. So I wanted to share a bit more about the interconnectivity between climate and nature and nutrition. And I'm going to do that with a concrete example. But thereafter, I want to react to some of the comments, talking about multifunctionality and how we mainstream biodiversity in policymaking, and how we reward farmers for actually the biodiversity services that they're providing. So just to say that when we talk about the trade-offs, it's not enough to actually look at the trade-offs between contributions to climate protection, but also to reducing biodiversity loss. There's also all of this big question around nutrition and health. I think, as Pablo was saying before, the farmers have been rewarded, and the companies have been rewarded for and paid for actually the production of calories in the past. The metrics has often been either volume or calories per hectare. And from a nutrition point of view, this is actually really wrong, because what we need to look at is the nutrition per hectare, first of all, if we just consider actually nutrition and health. So that's a big change that needs to happen. But second of all, we need to then really include in there as well all of what relates to the environment and the social side. So contribution to farmer livelihoods, as well as to protecting the planetary boundaries. What we found to be something really interesting is actually the potential for diversification of crops. And in particular, when I say we, I mean WBCSE and my project together with OP2B, we deep dived into staple crops and published a report a few months ago that was looking at what is the potential to diversify from the 5 key staple crops that we're using today. Those 5 key staple crops, which are wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, and soy, they actually represent 60% of the food intakes of the world. And so why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because, as was said before, they're often grown in monocultural systems, therefore that are not conducive to actually good environmental outcomes. But they're also actually not resilient in front of climate change. They're often not adapted to the local conditions. For instance, corn actually uses a lot of water. And finally, they actually really do not produce the best nutrition that is possible. And so diversification, such as what ICRISAT has tried with a program called Smart Food, and some attempts they've made on millet in Asia and in Africa, is actually able to contribute on all of those pieces. The difficulty, however, is that today the food value chain is basically structured around maximizing the potential of a few crops. And so diversification means basically overcoming a number of hurdles along the food value chain for the business, basically from procurement that is very specialized, that relies on the same staple crops coming from all over the world, to R&D, to processing, all the way to marketing and how you sell things to consumers. And what the ICRISAT program was showing was really interesting is actually you can work, and you need to work all the way along the food value chain to actually change those processes and really connect all of that when you, for instance, introduce millet. The difficulty here is on the consumption side, the fact that the whole food environment that is basically made of the marketing efforts, but also the way the food environment is today, the social groups and all of that, they're all conducive to wanting to eat more and more the same things. And so when people demand pizza or pasta, then what the program has been doing is see how you can actually use millets, but still providing some of the products that actually some of the groups are aspiring for. So I'd love to deep dive into that, but I don't think I can. But to come back to some of the remarks before, I think something that is really critical is this concept of the true value of food that we've been trying to push. The concept of true value of food is to actually indeed reflect all of the contributions, all of the impacts, positive and negative, of food along the environmental, social, and health components. And by actually integrating this and doing a thorough analysis of your impacts and your dependencies, then you are able to actually really change the frameworks, the policy framework and the finance frameworks, which is exactly what's needed today. So instead of subsidies, for instance, agricultural subsidies that go towards producing in mass a certain type of staple crop, we need a reform of those subsidies in order to really look at how to best deliver against environmental, social, and health outcomes. So I think I'll stop here and look forward to a further discussion.
Great, thanks, Emmeline, for emphasizing that kind of nutrition and whole value chain approach, as well as the true value of food that comes with that. Webster, also continuing on maybe the nutrition focus, but also from a youth movement perspective, what would you like to add in terms of how to further strengthen these win-win in food systems between people's outcomes and planet outcomes?
Okay, I think from a youth perspective, one of the major focuses, one of the selling points we really need to look at is to reevaluate what a win-win is, because a win-win can be like a win now for the current state of affairs today, but looking at it into the future, it might not be a win as such. So that I look at it from a youth perspective, whereas if we're saying we are producing at the cost of the planet, or we are farming at the cost of the planet, how with that then, even though we are winning now in terms of food production or in terms of agriculture, how does that affect the planet, in the future? So that's just how I see it, basically from a youth perspective. But then on the good side of it now, we then just have to tip the scales between people and planet, and just saying like, how we engage us as the people, like say, like in particularly looking at it from a food production kind of view, how we produce our food has to benefit the planet in a way, so that in that way we are able to win. We can have like young people, like for now, the young people that are farming use smart technology and farming and looking into farming, maybe doing a farming method like aquaponics or hydroponics, or doing like regenerative agriculture. That way, even though they're like producing food, they're in some way also helping gain a win for the planet. And so basically that's how I think of it and how I view it, like from a youthful perspective. But one of the major concerns from me is to really reevaluate and to reimagine what a win is, because a win can be a win now, but then looking at it from a youthful perspective, in the near future or in the years to come, we would have seen that we would have done damage instead of it like actually being a win.
Yeah, super. Thanks very much, Webster, for putting that time perspective on the what is a win-win at the short time, what is a win-win on the medium and the long term, and that is also often when we consider the true cost of food that Emmeline was mentioning. What is the true cost now, but what is the true cost when we consider the broader time perspective? Yeah. So thanks also very much for emphasizing that from your perspective. There are some great questions coming in from the audience, from which we will take some now with the panel and with the speakers. So there is one from DRC, that circular economy, especially in DRC and Africa broader, remains a novel concept. How can we make farmers more aware about it? And how can we assure that at local level, farmers use it to boost synergy between the food system and the environment? Now, if any of you would like to volunteer for that. Pablo, do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Sure, because I'm actually at the moment working with an NGO in Africa, in East Africa, on circular economy business models, and it's of course, you know, circular economy is intrinsic to agroecology, to traditional knowledge about how farmers recycle within the farm, and also between commons, as Wei was explaining, and agricultural land. So I mean, we recognize different loops in this of opportunity, from the non-monetary recycling within the farm, which could biofertilizers, things like those, to you know, local recycling and local sourcing. For example, with a lot of waste that we're measuring that is left after local markets have been there for just a single day. Livestock waste, vegetable waste, it's a lot of material there that is not used, to recycling, really connecting with urban areas or with remote or distant processing areas, processing like sugarcane factories and things like those, but also, or evisceration of fish in areas, in this case around Lake Victoria, but also surprisingly, even small towns, they have a lot of problem with organic waste in towns, in small towns, and it's very hard for them to manage that. Anything that is inorganic can be more or less recycled, separated already, and there is a market. But the organic, there is no market. So I think there is an opportunity there to create a business. Value added with this circular approach. So I'm happy that the colleague from DRC mentioned this.
Super. Thanks, Pablo. Yeah.
We're talking about technologies like you know, all kinds of bio-based technologies that can actually be used to enhance that. But already with what we have, there is value to be added, but just being a little bit more efficient.
Great, thanks, Pablo. Maybe you can share some of the insights of these business models with our colleague from IATA who's raising the question. So yeah, another question is around the ways of policymakers supporting climate smart agriculture practices. So the question is, are there any examples of where policymakers have effectively supported the scaling and replication of climate smart agriculture practices? Are there any reflections that can be shared on the potential for more standardized approaches? And Fabrice, you volunteered to start answering this question. Thanks.
I think Alejandra gave some really great examples from Costa Rica, right? So where the government has recognized that it's not just reforestation that contributes to climate mitigation, but that agroforestry and agricultural practices contribute to it, and are rewarding that through a payment-free service. So that's a great way by which that value has been recognized. I'm excited by at least the language I see in the European Union's farm to fork and biodiversity strategies, which are quite strongly aligned. A bit disappointed by the reaction from the farming community in line or out of line with that strategy. So I hope that we'll be able to create a space for better dialogue, discussion, and alignment with that community. But the other piece that I think the comment struck me with was in the question, it was the reflections on more standardized approaches. And I think standardized approaches are what worry me. I've seen so many studies that have said, you know, the way that we're going to mitigate climate and agriculture is through no-till. That's great for Iowa and for areas with deep soils. But if I'm in Brazil or in Oxisalt, it's going to be agroforestry. And so I'm hoping that we can move away from standardized approaches, which then impose on farmers what someone else thinks is the right action, to maybe standardized measures, right? So the measure is carbon capture on farm. And if a farmer can best do that with an agroforest or with an orchard, with a plantation, let's reward and recognize that. If a farmer can do that best with no-till or managing field margins, let's reward that. And so I hope that as we look towards policies that incentivize actions in agriculture, that we can align on the metrics, but that we're much, much more flexible in terms of what kinds of practices are applicable, and that we allow the farming community to identify those, and that should be accompanied, of course, the scientific community in terms of measuring outcomes. So much more accompaniment, but also allowing a much greater diversity of practice to emerge rather than standardizing practices.
Great, thanks, Fabrice. So kind of standardizing outcome measures or outcome metrics, but not the pathways to achieve them. There is more to tailor them to the conditions there. Yeah, thanks, Alejandra. You also want to comment on that.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to expand a little bit on that. I think I totally agree with Fabrice's point of there's so many different approaches that we can actually implement on the ground to make to have the good practices that we want be implemented. In Latin America and the Caribbean, for instance, like one example is payment for ecosystem services, but there's many other examples of policies that are being conducted right now, and there's a lot of efforts that are being implemented in the last 2 decades to try to move things towards a more sustainable production systems. Many different opportunities now are including, for instance, agroforestry systems such as nationally appropriate mitigation actions, the nationally determined contributions by countries, but there's also other historically used approaches or policies such as natural protected areas, but how we can also include the private and public sector and have like this co-management strategy. Some of the things is that in recent years, we've been talking more and more about ecosystem-based adaptation, nature-based solutions, even thinking about infrastructure, how we can help all of those new approaches to actually be implemented on the ground and have some real impact on biodiversity conservation and trying to find this balance between food production and conservation. So I think we are at a good momentum, I think, to leverage many things that are going around us. The actual health crisis that we've been embedded for the last 2 years is actually opened up many different opportunities as well, with a big push to the One Health approach, which is going to be in the same level of importance, the ecosystem health, human health, and also the environment. So I think we are actually at a good moment to try to take advantage of the opportunities that have emerged from this not so good situation. So yeah, that would be my contribution. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alejandra. Maybe a follow-up question related still to kind of the Costa Rica scheme, like how dependent have the farmers become actually on this payment for ecosystem services, and who do you think should be paying for the environmental services these farmers produce? Like, what is the long-term business model also behind this?
That's a very interesting question, and one of the important things that we need to maybe to point out about the payment for ecosystem services in Costa Rica model is that when it started back in 1997 or 98, it was created with a clear route on how to finance the payment for ecosystem services, and that's through a tax on gasoline and hydrocarbons. So today, that's the main source of funds to pay for this program. I don't think farmers have become accustomed or dependent of this program, because the actual payment that it goes into the contracts is not that much, but it was created in a way that it goes hand in hand with the forest law of 1996, which basically forbids people to cut down the forest. So it's a good strategy to keep both things in sync. On one hand, there's a prohibition. I mean, you're not allowed to cut down the primary forest or forest in general. But on the other hand, if you have forests, you can access these funds. It's not perfect. Again, one of the things that is happening now is that there's a huge demand and not not that many funds to actually include everyone into the program. In the last years, for instance, there has also been some budget cuts to the program that are affecting their ability to actively engage more people into the program. And talking about trade-offs, as we think about climate change and we move towards clean energies, that means we're not going to get that much of the tax on gasoline and hydrocarbons. So how is the program going to fund it? How is going to get funded? So one of the things that the good government is trying to figure out, but in the general, I think it's a good strategy. It's again not perfect, and here I want to say again what Fabrice mentioned. We can't have only one solution. So PES is great, but it's not going to solve the problem. We need other things. We need to recognize farmers for what they do. We need to think a little bit more about how the markets can pay for good practices that are conducted at plot level, at the farm level, and how that benefits biodiversity and environmental, and that at the long run, it actually allows countries to deliver on the commitments as nations. So I think we need to think about a set of solutions and not only one. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alejandra. And Emmeline, do you also want to add to that? See you.
Yes, please. Thank you. No, I think this is a really critical question, is how we're going to pay for those services. And I like the testimony before talking about the potential to tax, and that's always an interesting thing, and we need to look into that. But my plea would be to really have a much more thorough macroeconomic approach to it and looking at all of the pieces of the puzzle. I know that Fabrice is actually working as part of EAT on an economic commission right now, which is looking at these macroeconomic pieces, because if you look at the whole system today, there is a number of subsidies that are being provided which just need to be redirected, not even before having to add any tax to anything. Secondly, increasingly, we are paying more and more for the health impacts and the environmental impacts that our system are creating. And so if we were to redirect this money to actually address the problem at the source and reduce the problem at the source. So let me be very, take an example, the fertilizers leakage in the water and all of the diseases that this is creating, or today the malnutrition that is created and the non-communicable disease. If all of the money that goes into that was redirected to actually subsidize a better way of producing better ingredients, potentially actually the numbers would fit. And that's what I really expect to see from this economic commission's work, and what we really need to work towards. So again, not working in silos, looking at health, environment, agriculture, all of that together. And that was the aim of the Food System Summit, which to a certain extent at least managed to change, I would say, the way people are thinking about it. And there is much more to be done in that sense. But yeah, multifunctionality and multi-factor thinking, I think, is going to be critical. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot, Emmeline. Wei, yeah, also from your perspective, would you like to add to that?
Thank you, Ro. Yeah, the comments raised by the panels are very inspiring. So I'd like to add that even if we're able to identify these potential synergies, it doesn't necessarily mean we'll be able to capture those synergies. You do need very targeted investment policies, and we need to work on restructuring the incentives to better align to the true costs and benefits of food systems. So again, here I like to re-emphasize the importance of evaluation of the externalities, both negative and positive, using methods such as true cost accounting to really bring the hidden costs. Emily gives some examples on health, to bring these hidden costs visible and have them accounted in decision making. So approaches we talk about circular economy. They fundamentally require system thinking and value chain approach. So both technological and social innovations are needed to integrate farmers as well as other actors in the value chain into the system so that they can benefit. And here again, the valuation has an important role to play in order to better identify losers, winners, the distributional effect, and to be able to design policy instruments to address potential inequity issues. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And maybe a final question for all the panelists is then, I mean, building on this discussion, and there has been a lot of discussion also around setting the right incentives, the systems approach, the multifunctionality. What type of capacities do we need to invest in more to further empower that from your perspective and with the types of groups that you work with? I'll start with Pablo. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, I think it's important to stress once again that any of these mechanisms we're mentioning, like Alejandra was saying, I mean, it's not a silver bullet. I mean, the same mechanisms in different contexts can create problems as well. For example, in a study we did recently on European subsidies in European agriculture versus taxes in South America, which actually export in South America are taxed up to 35%. So that's interesting for the governments because they can get money, cash to finance other social programs. So actually, we have like a mirror situation where a place where things are taxed and a place where things are subsidized. And the outcomes are horrible in both cases, you know, because they both mechanisms are actually promoting a type of system that has all these bad consequences that we've been discussing here. So I think, and that's where, you know, people who design those taxes or those subsidies are working in silos. So I think I echo what Evelyn was saying. I mean, and that is one of the problems of the type of professional we are creating at the universities, you know, which are people who are specialized in a certain discipline and reasoning from within that discipline, within those assumptions, and not being able to look at the larger picture. So I think it's as we discussed in another webinar with the water, land, and ecosystem. I think it's important to slowly try to, you know, demolish the barriers between these disciplines and create professionals who are able to actually speak to each other and to be functionally multidisciplinary, you know, not just being able to know a little bit of everything, but also being able to understand each other and to make multidisciplinary efforts part of their daily bread, you know. So I think from the capacity development, that's for me is to reshape the profile of the professionals we're creating to address these problems.
Great, yeah, thanks, Pablo. Alejandro, do you want to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Rosalind. I really like Pablo's idea of thinking about multifunctionality. I think that as an ecologist, we think about, you know, all the things that are going on, all the interactions, the variables, and all the organisms that are interacting. And there's so much we don't know about it, but we know it is important. And we know that the whole food system or survival as well depends on these interconnections and these interactions. So I think it's a really good idea to think that we need to see at the bigger picture. We need to think about how to integrate these many different variables that are going on in the systems and always be aware of the complexity of the problem. I think that many times we just downsize the problem to simple answers. And I know we need to provide answers to people, but we constantly need to remind ourselves that it's not that simple and that potentially one solution might create other problems somewhere else. So I think that's very interesting. Something else that I think it's also important to realize, and the current condition again puts us on the spot, is that we need to think about cross-sectoral coordination and collaboration. Many times we talk about, well, the private and the public and you know, the agriculture and environment need to work together, but also finance and economy and many other different aspects. Now, health ministers, now more than ever, is obvious that our health and our survival depends on environments, and how we deal with the environmental issues is critical, but we still don't do it. I mean, I don't know exactly how it is in Europe, Asia, or other places, but in Latin America, it's incredible to me that nowadays there's one place that handles agriculture, another place that handles environment, and they don't talk to each other. So how do we want to come up with complex solutions if we're not coordinating efforts? So to me, that's what's a big important aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandra. And it will also be really great to hear from Webster also on this, as he's also literally sitting at the university now. So Webster, what do you think in terms of the type of capacities we need to invest more on?
Well, for starters, I'd like to agree with Pablo about the issue about, like, the kind of students that are being produced. I think it will be farming agriculture. I'm speaking like from an African perspective, particularly like in a sub-Saharan African perspective. Farming is something that is looked down upon, and growing up as a child, you don't want to venture in farming. You definitely want to get an office job. So if you're able to, cultivate a culture in young people that.
Oh, unfortunately, the connection broke. Yeah, we lost you, Webster. I don't know if Emmeline, Fabrice, or Wei still want to add before we close.
I think it's just something that Webster was saying that's maybe important. I see a growing tension between farming communities and urban communities, and I think a lot of our environmental messaging is on how degradative farming is. And I hope that we're able to flip the narrative and really recognize that if you want to be an environmentalist, become a farmer. If you want to work on public health, become a farmer. If you want to, and I think the livelihood opportunities that come with that need to accompany it. But this really is our best bet at environment, at health, and at so many outcomes. But I feel it's a community that feels dramatically undervalued. There's a loss of youth that wants to work in it. But this really is, I think, one of the most critical employment opportunities that we have. And if we can change that narrative to agriculture being a solution and farming being an activist, if you want, even employment, that we should be moving in that direction.
Super. Thanks so much for all these contributions of the panelists and of the questions and the speakers. Also, with this as a final note, we would like to note that this webinar will also contribute to this kind of learning modules on synergies and trade-offs that we have been building, and to further reflect on these questions about what type of capacities we need, and to grow upon this. More than 25 contributors have already contributed to this, as well as the Innovative Food System Solutions portal to build food system solutions together, tailored to the different needs, not to focus on golden bullets, but to help bundle different solutions with each other. So I invite you also to, if you're interested in this topic of today, to further explore these materials that are online or that will be coming online further in November. So with this, I thank the panel and all the speakers and all the participants very much for the great, very lively discussion today, and to flag that the next webinar of this series will be Tuesday, the 26th of October. The information also is in the chat. Thank you very much.